It's Cougar Sports Saturday.
That's caught! Touchdown! Stayed inside the boundary and gets in for 6.
Cougar Sports Saturday, a presentation of KSL Sports.
Richie right to the rim, driving score! He would not be denied!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Sponsored by Any Hour Services, Electrical, Plumbing, Heating, and Air. Your hosts are Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Hour number 3 is off and running here on Cougar Sports Saturday. Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland with you. It's BYU basketball game day. BYU, the number 9 ranked team in the country, is going to take on the Utah Utes. Rivalry game, third installment of this rivalry in the Big 12 era. Last year, BYU split the 2 games with the Utes. Lost at the Huntsman Center, won at the Marriott Center. They're back at it in the the Huntsman Center tonight. 8 p.m. tip-off, television broadcast on ESPN, radio call right here on KSL News Radio. Pregame begins at 7 o'clock. Real quick, before we get to an interview I had with Utah insider Steve Bartle, BYU women's basketball, off to a strong start. They got another win today. They took down Houston in the Fertitta Center, 79-64. So Lee Kumard and his team are now up to 14-3 overall, 3-2 in conference play. They had a tough loss on the road at previously winless Arizona in league play. But what we've learned is that women's basketball under Lee Kumard, they've gotten better. They've already exceeded last year's win total of 13 games, up to 14 wins. So shout out to Lee Kumard and the BYU women's basketball team. But shifting gears to the men's basketball team, they're going to be taking on the Utes. And I caught up with Utah insider Steve Bartle with KSLSports.com and asked Steve how he would assess year one under Alex Jensen so far as the Utes come into tonight's matchup with an 8-7 record and 0-2 mark in Big 12 play thus far.
Yeah, honestly, came into the season with pretty low expectations. I thought Utah could compete for, 12, 11, 10 in the Big 12 if everything, came together and they got things, development out of key players and all of that. But so far to this season, it's been a little underwhelming, a little disappointing, even with the low expectations. And they dropped a couple games that they probably shouldn't have. And, I think with Utah, the injury to Babacar Faye, who, he was a big man that I think, would have been, a bit of a difference maker for Utah this season. He would have added size, length inside. He would have added, ability that currently isn't on the roster, isn't present with this group in terms of his ability to score in the paint and to even stretch the floor a little bit as a big man. So I think his presence certainly would have helped. How much it would have helped, I don't know, but I think there's certainly reason to think his presence could have helped Utah in a game against a Cal or against a Washington. But so far through Big 12, I think Utah has gotten a pretty tough lesson, or Alex Jensen has gotten a pretty tough lesson so far of what Big 12 play is all about. Seeing this team, against Arizona, who, number 1 in the country for a reason. They've got size, athleticism, talent, and just seeing the difference between that team and Utah was pretty striking. And so I think, so far to this season, like I said, it's been a little underwhelming, a little disappointing, even with the understanding that this is a tear it down to the studs type of rebuild for Utah. There's been some positives certainly, but I think overall that's been the general vibe and takeaway so far with Utah basketball.
What's the outlook for Saturday night against BYU for Utah?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough test, right? Like I said, with Arizona, seeing that difference between Arizona and Utah was pretty noticeable. And obviously with BYU and the talent that they've brought in, I think it's going to be a pretty tall order for Utah in that game. But I do think the Huntsman crowd, with all of the criticism of the Huntsman crowd and how light it is for most of these games, Utah fans show up for this one for obvious reasons, and so I'm curious to see what sort of impact that has on the game. I think there is talent, there is ability on this Utah squad to make it competitive. They've been better at home than they've been on the road, but this is going to require Utah's not just their best effort, but an effort that we haven't seen from them so far this season, and that's asking a lot. It's going to take their best on the defensive end of the floor, which has been the biggest issue for Utah so far this season. They have potential on that end of the floor with the athleticism that they have, but just haven't been able to put forth a consistent 40 minutes of effort on that end of the floor. And when you've got a group that has the talent, the experience that BYU has, it's going to be a tall order. But I think Utah, with the crowd behind them, maybe that makes a difference to make it a little bit more competitive. But this is going to require, like I said, Utah's not just their best effort, but an effort that we haven't seen so far this season.
The Huntsman Center's been a tough place for BYU since 2011, only 2 wins in that building, the last one coming in 2021. So it's been a minute since these two teams, or since BYU won in that venue. I'm curious, too, who would you say is the best player on this Utah team right now?
Yeah, I think it comes down to 2 players, Terrence Brown, Keanu Dawes. Those are the guys. Terrence Brown is, a consistent bucket getter, right? He's a guy that you want the ball in his hands late in the game because he can create scoring opportunities for himself. He can get to the foul line. He's been a big reason why Utah has been able to score at the rate that they have. They've been a pretty solid offensive team. Keanu Dawes he does so much, and he does it quietly. And I think there's been a lot of conversation around Keanu because we all see the talent, we see the ability, we see the potential in him. He's 6'9", he's 225, 230 pounds. He is often the most talented player on the floor, but I shouldn't say most talented player, but I think a lot of people believe he's got a lot of talent and a lot of potential that he just hasn't unsurfaced yet. And I think Alex Jensen has talked about Keanu this season in a way that I think has been honest. They're trying to draw more out of him, right? They're trying to draw that mentality out of him. You can have all the talent, but if you don't have the mentality to assert yourself and to be aggressive and to look for your scoring opportunities, to go grab rebounds, to play like you're the best player on the floor, that's tough. That's where you kind of see guys quietly go about impacting the game, and that's been Keanu Dawes so far this season. He had a performance a couple weeks ago where you finally saw the aggression level that I think Alex has wanted to see from him, that Utah fans have wanted to see from him. So there has been progress in terms of his development where he has become more assertive. But I think the consistency from him is going to be the big thing. And I think this is a big opportunity in this matchup. There's some intriguing matchups from a personnel standpoint that I think, you're going to need Keanu to be that type of player for Utah to have any sort of chance. But certainly for Utah, it's Terrence Brown, it's Keanu Dawes. Don McHenry also deserves a mention here because he has been so effective scoring the ball. But I think it's Brown and Dawes and then McHenry at the top of the roster for Utah.
Do you think Dawes will get the assignment on DeBonsa?
That's going to be an interesting one, and yeah, I do think he'll get some time on DeBonsa. I think Seydou Traore will also get some time there. Utah's got some athletes, at that spot where they can throw different looks at DeBonsa, but I think it'll be primarily a combination of those two, Keanu Dawes and Seydou Traore. Both of whom, Seydou's 6'7", 220, Keanu Dawes 6'9", 230. Have the athleticism. DeBonsa is such a special talent that you can have the size, you can have the athleticism, but he just has the talent and ability to to do a lot. So it's going to require, like I said, an effort that we haven't seen so far. But those will be the guys primarily in that matchup.
It's interesting in the football rivalry with BYU and Utah. There's so much crossover between the coaching staffs, the players. I don't get that sense with basketball. Dawes is one of the few guys that has a little bit of connections to BYU. His uncle Derek played at BYU back in the day, but really there's not much. Richie Saunders for BYU, he was a local guy and means a lot to him, but do you think that's something that maybe, and I'm trying to gauge because with BYU and Utah, the rivalry in basketball, it just maybe hasn't had anywhere near the intensity of football. And I know football is the king of sports these days, but there was a time when BYU and Utah in basketball in the 70s and 80s, maybe that coincides with before the Jazz arriving, but where this was a big-time deal. And I thought there'd be a little more intensity with this, with now being back in a league, but it feels like, I know BYU's having a lot of success in Utah still, as you know, to trying to tear this thing down to the studs and build this up in Alex Jensen's image, but just what do you maybe attribute to maybe just a lack of local flair in this matchup?
Well, I think it gets back to where Utah's been as a basketball program, right? BYU came into the Big 12 and, they were able to compete right away. And with Kevin Young and that addition, to say he started on third base, makes it sound like it's an insult to Kevin Young, but it's a compliment to the BYU program and where it was. And now Kevin Young has come in and he's been able to elevate that, to an even higher level, right? And so I think BYU has done a lot with basketball and Utah has not, right? We know what the Utah basketball program has been over the last 6, 7, 8 years. The apathy has set in. It set in a couple years ago with a lot of the tried and true fans that have just been burnt out by the program and what it's done and what it's the lack of success that it's had. And I think with the hiring of Jensen, obviously it speaks to Utah's recommitment to the basketball program. And I think Alex has taken the long-term view with this basketball rebuild. And I think, you don't fault him for having that sort of mindset of, building, hitting your stride into year 2 and year 3 where you start to really see the gains and positive momentum. But I think the game has changed so much over the last couple of years where you can flip a roster and become competitive in an instant. And I think a lot of fans were hoping to see that this year. But Jensen, like I said, has maintained that this is a long-term type view with his program and what he's trying to do. And I think, as we get into year 2 and year 3, that's where I believe that Utah fans are going to get back into the basketball program. I think it's so important to have not only a healthy football program, but a healthy basketball program as well. I think when you have that, you're doing a lot of good things. And I think Utah has the right guy in Jensen to get Utah back to where it needs to be, to get the support, to get the fan base back in the Huntsman again and all of that. And so I think it's on Utah, right? If we want to talk about the rivalry and the lack of flair around it, it's on Utah to get the program back to where it needs to be, to where these two programs are at the top of the conference and competing in the Big 12 together at the top. I think it's all on Utah to get there and to get this rivalry back to what it was. Mitch, you and I are very similar age, similar experiences. You're just blue, I'm red, and we grew up watching the basketball programs, right? Mm-hmm. I went to the basketball camps under Rick Majerus. There's a lot of pride in that basketball program. Even throughout the 2000s, that rivalry was the big rivalry game in this state. It was the basketball game and all of that. And I think there's a big desire from the Utah supporters to get the basketball program back to that state. It's just, again, with Jensen and his vision.
That's Steve Bartle, Utah insider for KSLSports.com. Appreciate him for catching up with me. You can listen to the full interview. We even talked some BYU and Utah football in the interview. It's up on the Cougar Tracks podcast feed, so you can go check that out wherever you get your podcast. Taking a break, we'll get to who's in, who's out for the availability report for BYU and Utah next.